for the city of Franklin. We will begin the meeting with a roll call vote. Alderman, this is the mayor is not here. Mr. Bull, are you present?
Yes, I'm here.
And Mrs. Carter, are you present?
Yes.
And Mr. Townsend, are you present?
Yes.
Mr. McGee, present. And the chair is present. So that's, Mr. McGee is not here and Mr. Moore is not here. So I knew about the mayor. The mayor's in Jackson.
McDaniel's here.
Daniel's here.
Yes, Mr. McGee is out of town, but he does send his regrets.
Okay, all right.
He wishes he could have been here with us.
The second item on the agenda is the approval of minutes for September the 12th. If everyone's had a chance to look at those, any corrections, deletions? If not, I'll entertain a motion.
I'll make a motion.
Is there a second?
Second.
Let's do a roll call vote again then. Mr. McDaniel,
Approve.
Mr. Townsend,
Approve.
Mr. Bull,
Approve.
and Ms. Carter,
Approve.
and the chair votes yes on that also. Item 3, investment report for 9/30/2022. Barry Bryant, DeHub Associates. Barry,
If
can
you
you
can
hear
get
us?
our report up and turn to page 4, I will start there. I'm going to try to do 3 things. Number 1, I'm not going to focus so much on the numbers on page 4 like I usually do. I'm going to focus on what's going on in the economy and what's going on in the market in general. Number 2, I'm going to talk about our numbers for the third quarter. Number 3, I'm going to go through the alternative investments and tell you where they stand right now and where they were going. So, starting at the beginning, if you look on on page 4 of the report, do you all have that up or do you have it in front of you? Doesn't matter which one.
Barry, I do have it pulled up, but we do have hard copies for our members.
I guess
So-
everybody else is on mute. All right, so I'm going to assume that you've got those numbers up. So, okay, no, that's fine. I'll just talk. I'll just talk from here on out. If for whatever reason you don't have the right numbers in front of you, just stop me. So, the economy right now is going really well in most respects, except for inflation. The GDP is between 2 and 3%. Unemployment, there basically is no unemployment. Things are rolling along pretty well, except for inflation. But inflation is pretty bad. It's the highest it's been since 1980. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to explain in 2 minutes or less how we got here and where we're going. So how we got here. When the pandemic hit, we had a shift from consumption of services to consumption of goods because we could get goods delivered, but people couldn't go out. Number 2, we had supply chain disruptions. Number 3, we had the shutdown of factories in China. So there was more demand for goods, but because of those second and third reasons, there was reduced supply. Number 4, Russia invaded Ukraine, energy prices went up, energy is the main input in food, and food went up. And then number 5, the government wrote a lot of stimulus checks. They wrote a lot of stimulus checks for both administrations, and those stimulus checks put a lot of money in circulation and also in some people's minds caused a disincentive to work. And so labor was pulled back. There was a belief in the macroeconomic community that those factors would be transitory. And you can see why. If you go through those one at a time, all of them should, at some point diminish. However, the problem is that once labor gets it in its head that there are going to be jobs, they're going to be good, you can work, blah, 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 and you can demand more wages, that psychology gets fixed. And as a result of that, the inflation just didn't go down the way economists thought it would be. At that point, the Fed switched positions. And one of the things which I believe that is over the course of my lifetime, beginning in the investment world in 1980, the Fed has really changed. The Fed used to be an organization that could be pushed around by the president. It can still be nudged by the president, but the members of the Federal Reserve Board if push comes to shove, are going to fight inflation if inflation is a problem, because they view that as their first and foremost job. And so I think the Fed has rededicated itself to doing that. I think it's going to push inflation down to probably 2%. It isn't that hard to get inflation down to 3% and 2.5%, but 2 is going to be tough. So my belief is that they are going to keep raising interest rates more or less, but keep raising them until that happens, and they probably are going to push the economy in the recession to do it probably in the second half of next year. Not a long recession, not a deep recession, but a recession nonetheless. There has been discussion of us being in a recession already, but a recession is really defined as decline in all the major sectors of the economy, and there is no labor recession right now. There are jobs for everybody that wants them, and I think that is going to have to change in order for the Fed to get the economy where it wants it to go. So that's what I think the economy is doing. Now the market. The stock market is, in theory, the discounted present value of future cash flows. So what that means is, if you take a bond and it has a 5% interest rate, it's worth, if it's a $100 bond and a 5% interest rate, it's worth $105 in a year, $110 in a year, plus compounding $115, plus more compounding in the third year, etc. By the same token, you can take money and move it backwards through time. You can take an amount of money in the future, you can divide by a discount rate instead of multiplying, and you can answer questions like, if I get a $100,000 inheritance 20 years from now, what is it going to be worth in present day dollars, given whatever you think the inflation rate is? Stocks are, in theory, the discounted present value of their future cash flows using a discount rate. And the discount rate is hugely important. Moving it by just 1 percentage point on $100,000 over 20 years can change the terminal value by $12,000, just to pick some random numbers. And so when the discount rate changes, it changes the theoretical value of the stock market, and that's what you're seeing right now. What you're seeing right now is every time an inflation number of whatever type or a number that relates to the inflation number comes out, the market recalibrates its estimate of what the Fed is going to do, and what the Fed is going to do is what changes the discount rate the market uses. And because of that, you're seeing these wild fluctuations up and down. In the third quarter, people have forgotten this, but the month of July was actually up, and then August was down sharply, and September was down even more sharply, and as you're about to see, the numbers in the third quarter were quite dismal. So far, the fourth quarter has been up in the first month, up in the second month, and up in the third month so far. Whether or not that's going to continue remains to be seen, but it is that changing impression of what the Fed is going to do that is causing the stock market to do what it's doing. So that is what I think is going on. My guess is the stock market's going to be higher a year from now than it is now, but I don't think it's going to be a straight trip up. I think there are going to be some earnings disappointments in the first quarter, and some likely market declines between now and later. So that's what we think is going on right now. Let's go now back to the third quarter and talk about the numbers for the quarter ended in September and how they affected us. Domestic stocks were down 5, foreign stocks were down 10, domestic fixed income was down 5, private real estate was up at just half a point, and the median return for all public plans of all sizes was negative 4.4%. That negative 4.4% was mostly because a lot of, especially the large public plans, including ours, have some illiquid assets that are not marked to market quickly. So the public markets, both stocks and bonds, were down more than that negative 4.4%, but large public plans on average managed to do a little bit better than that. That will change as those weak numbers bleed into their valuations over time. Now, how did we do? Let's go to page 8. Okay, I don't have that on my screen, but I'm going to assume that you all are there. So, page 8. We were Ooh, I've got the wrong report up on my screen, so I'm gonna have to read from my notes here. Correct me if I'm wrong about anything. Our return was negative 4.3%. It ranked in the 48th percentile. The TCRS portfolio was down 4.5%, and remember, the average portfolio was down 4.4. So our 4.3 was a little bit better than average. TCRS was a little bit worse than average. TCRS is one of those large portfolios that has a fair number of illiquids. So you would have thought they would have done, I would have thought they would have done a little bit better than average, and they didn't. And I'm going to explain why in just a second. So positives for us. Our timber allocations actually pulled our numbers up a little bit. We had one timber allocation that was very strong, and those were not affected as much by interest rates and the other negatives. Housing is in relatively good shape, although that is changing. But the timber helped us a little bit. That made our numbers a little bit better than the TCRS average. Negatives. If you go to page 18 in the report, that's where the TCRS numbers are. If you go all the way down to the bottom, you'll see how our fixed income portfolio did, which is not very well. If you remember, I've talked about this a lot because it is the one thing about TCRS that is characteristically different. Most issues with TCRS are how well they execute versus other large state plans, but this is a place where they are characteristically different from any other large state plans. They have a long duration bond portfolio. That means, to put it simply, more 10-year bonds than 2-year bonds. Long duration bonds are much more sensitive to changes in interest rates. When interest rates go down, the prices go up. When interest rates go up, the prices go down. In this quarter, the prices went up. This portion of the portfolio went down a lot and pulled down the average to a little bit below the long-term average. Now, why do they do that? He has a philosophical belief that you're going to do better in long-dated bonds than short-dated bonds over time, and so they're just going to put the needle there and leave it there. And that assertion, generally speaking, is correct. You typically will do better in long-dated bonds than short-dated bonds over time, but not in this interest rate environment. So that hurt them a little bit, but their return was average, wasn't bad. So that's what, and the other areas of the TCS portfolio, some were a little better average, some were a little below average, but it was the bond portfolio that really, moved the numbers more than anything else. The last thing I'm going to talk about are the alternatives. And to look at those, if you can go back to page 8, if you want to look at them there. But I'm going to go through some numbers that aren't, I'm going to go through some numbers on page 8, so that's not really going to help much. These numbers are mostly from the appendices at the end of our reports. I don't refer to them very much because they're complicated and technical, and these are little bits and pieces, but right now I'd like to go over them. So starting with the first one. The first one is Hamilton Lane Secondary Fund 3. It's a private equity fund. Secondaries are little bits and pieces of portfolios that they purchase from other people that are repositioning their portfolio. There's a whole world of secondaries that exist. They can be quite profitable. This particular portfolio, its return is 10.3, the private market equivalent, which is what we would have gotten if we had invested in a global equity benchmark instead of of the secondaries fund. The private market equivalent was 9.5, so we did a little better than that. Not as much as I would have hoped, but a little bit better. They've called 78% of the money. They're probably not going to call the rest of the money. This is, in the process of winding down over time. Landmark was one of our first, in fact, it was our first private equity, started in 2010. It is winding down, it has a 9.4% internal rate of return. The 3 timber funds, starting with BTG, that started in 2007. It is winding down now. It has a 0 IRR, so we neither made nor lost money in nominal terms, in real terms, including inflation. Obviously, we did lose money over that time. The reason that fund did not do as well is starting in 2007, they were buying properties at the peak before the great financial crisis. When the great financial crisis hit, housing went into the tank. It never quite recovered over the ensuing 10 years, so this was just, very bad timing. The second fund that we got in was RMS. That started in 2012. It will end sometime between now and 3 years from now, depending on renewals. They can, extend the life of the fund for a period of time. It has a 3.8% internal rate of return, which is an annual rate of return. And then finally, FIA, which is the youngest of the three, it is set to run for another 3 to 5 years. It has a 3.3% internal rate of return. They had a very nice return. I think they had a 7 or a 9 something return in the fourth quarter. And one quarter doesn't necessarily mean anything, but I note that for what it's worth. So within 5 years, we should be out of all of these illiquids, and they will wind down mostly in the next 3 years, with the exception of this last timber return. Russ and I are going to listen to a call on one of these after the first of the year. There's a lot going on in terms of selling properties right now toward the end of the year, and a lot of issues about valuation because of all the uncertainty in the market. So that's where we are on the alternatives. With that, I am done, and I will open for questions.
Any questions from the committee? Any questions from anyone other than the committee? Eric, you have any comments?
No, we do not.
Okay.
If I may just refer in
Christine?
Barry's presentations is very comprehensive, and certainly his document has lots of information, but at the bottom of page 6 on the executive summary, if you just want a snapshot of our market value, I think that's something helpful to look at. We do send this report out on a quarterly basis. Our market value for 9/30 was $135 million. They're in the bottom right of that page in the little box. As Barry was alluding to, certainly the third quarter was a difficult quarter. We started at $141 million, ended up at $135. And that's pretty much been our tale except for that 1 month. And in the summertime, it's been a rough year for our investment returns. We have our next valuation for the closed pension is December the 31st. And that's certainly where we have our actuary, Kevin Sullivan, with us. That is the basis of the next actuary report, is the market value for 12/31. So that's what we're looking toward on the closed plan, is the market value of 12/31. For our open plan with TCRS, that valuation date is June 30th. So we've already had, and that's our smaller plan because, of course, that's for our employees hired in the last 6 years or so. It's a smaller plan for assets, but that valuation date of June 30th has come and passed for the getting ready on the next report for them. But we are looking for 12/31 on the closed plan.
Let me just mention, since we're trying to put this into context, this was the worst beginning of the year, 3-quarter period for a 60-40 portfolio, 60% equities, 40% fixed income, at least in the last 40 years and maybe ever. And the reason it was so negative is because there are periods when the stock market goes down. There are a few periods where the bond market goes down. But there really are no periods when the stock market and the bond market both go down by this much. A 5% decline in the bond market, which is what we had in the third quarter, is a huge bond market decline. And it's because of the reversal in interest rates that's causing it, which obviously is a cyclical thing and isn't going to go on forever. But this is an unusually bad period. And if you're looking at the amount of money in your fund, it's gone down a lot, but it is an unprecedented period of time, and the market will come back. But that's what we're looking at now.
Any other questions or comments of Barry? If not, then let's go to the annual report from Human Resources. Sarah, you are up.
Hello, thank you. I don't have a whole lot of information to share, but I did pull some numbers for you. So since January 1st of 2022, we've got 95 new hires, so they're in the TCRS plan. This year, we see a slightly lower number of retirees. So since March, we've had about 5 retire, and then in this month, in December, we'll have 8. So like a total of 13 retirees this year, which we usually have, I'd say we usually have around 20 or 23. And then in the TCRS matching plan, so those that are in TCRS and have completed 2 years of service, they can opt into the matching 457, 401 retirement plan. So we have 49 people in that, and only around 2 people have enrolled this year in it. And then the last number I have for you is we have currently paying through TCRS 283 retirees on our retiree payroll. So
Is that about it?
that's about it.
All right.
Simple and to the point.
And how many retirees have you had this year? 8 and 5?
We're going to have 8 in December, and then total this year, calendar year, 13.
13.
Yeah, so we're slightly lower than we normally are. Usually December's like anywhere from 12 to 15 in just December alone.
So half.
Yeah, I would say so. We've been pretty consistent in prior years with those numbers.
Any questions from the committee on the number of retirees or anything that's on Sarah's report? All right. Let's go to item 5, then report on the deferred compensation retirement program. Christine, you're up.
Well, I did add this to the agenda just to have a highlight. We haven't talked about our deferred compensation program in a while. I believe a couple of years ago, we did have a representative from our deferred compensation program do a review for this committee, and we're going to do that again, hopefully in '23. But just a couple things to get on the committee's radar is that probably the most important thing, since you've heard from us about the deferred compensation program, is that our company that manages that has had a name change. And they were known as ICMA-RC, a big acronym probably for the entire time of most of our, at least in all the years I've worked with that company, they were known as ICMA-RC. And they have changed their name to Mission Square. It is the same organization, and in fact, we have our same local representative that's assigned to Franklin. They have not seemed to make wholesale staff changes or anything like that. They do have a new website, and they do have a new login for participants, and certainly our employee reps may be familiar with the new login. They've made quite a few changes with making that more secure, but it's also a brand-new site to get used to how everything is reported for the employee online. We still do have our local representation with Trey Sizemore. He is still available for appointments and comes by to visit. My understanding from HR is that his appointments are very popular, and when those are available, our employees do sign up for those and take advantage of that opportunity. So that is still something that we do offer. Wow.
We must not pay the electricity
Whoa.
bill.
We didn't pay the bill at this section.
That can mean so many things. And then something else that I did want to highlight from our perspective is certainly that while the deferred compensation program, for most of our employees, it's not a mandatory program. Some of our employees that were hired toward the start, there was some mandatory participation in deferred compensation, but in recent years, it's not been a mandatory program. and it's voluntary. We certainly do have a good number of voluntary participants. We, some of our participants, when I look at the list of how many participants per plan, we have the same employee that's a participant in 2 or 3 plans, because we have Roth IRA, we have a 457, we have a 401A. So one employee could be actually 3 participants or 2 participants, given what he or she is enrolled in. So we do currently have, or at least as of late October, we had 1,362 participants in deferred compensation, and many of those are one person that's a member of 2 or even 3 plans. So that's an encouragement that people are planning for their retirement. In looking at the balances, certainly, we just got through hearing from Barry about what's going on with investment returns for a large pension plan. And that is something that certainly, when just looking at balances in total, our employees who are members of deferred compensation plans are probably experiencing. You certainly hear that from people who are looking at their own plans. But when I do look at the balance on 12/31/2020, we had $26.9 million of market value for our city employees who are part of deferred compensation. That's a significant amount of money there. It had grown by 17% by the end of '21, up to over $31 million, and that was both contributions employees are putting into their deferred compensation, but also market returns. And we know that the calendar year of '21 was a better year. That is down 11.5% toward the end of October. That was down to about $28.3 million. So we do know that what they were experiencing with the closed plan is certainly what we are seeing for people who are investing for their retirement through the deferred compensation plan. So just wanted to give you that, just a little bit of a highlight on the deferred comp program. We still have the deferred compensation program, and in fact, we do have voluntary participation where people can, they don't have to wait for an open enrollment to participate or make changes in their amounts that they're putting to their Roth or to their 457. That can be changed throughout the year, and our HR department administers that as well. So I will look to get actually someone from Mission Square to give a committee update next year, but that program still exists, and we have significant participation, especially for a program that's primarily a voluntary program.
Any questions on the report of deferred compensation retirement program? I think it would be a good idea if we did have somebody from Mission Square. Yes.
We will do that next year.
All right. Let's go to item 6, consideration of resolution 2022-78, third amendment to the amended and restated pension plan effective January the 1st, 2018, related to the definition of average compensation.
All right, I'll kick it off,
Okay.
and I know
Okay.
Christine and Kevin and Frank will all jump in on this too, but I'll start it off. This is a follow-on to an item we talked to you about last time we met, and we are preparing a resolution and a proposed third amendment to the pension plan to reflect a change in how we calculate the average compensation. And the basic gist of it is moving from a whole calendar year calculation to a comparable number of months. So those employees hired before 2010, we average that average compensation now on 3 calendar years, 3 full calendar years. This would move to a 36-month calculation for those folks. The folks hired after, I think it's February of 2010, that are still in the closed pension plan, they have a 5-year basis for that averaging. They would move from 5 full calendar years to 60 months. So same period of time, but not kind of framing it in the calendar year, but in the number of months. So it provides some level of flexibility for employees as they consider that retirement. What Sarah referenced at her presentation is really a function of that largely. The reason we have so many retirements in December is that whole calendar year factors into that. And so this might change that calculation somewhat. There may be still some other incentives for folks to still retire at the end of the year, depending on how they've accrued sick time and other things. But this would be a change. It would provide some flexibility to employees, and that's why we have reviewed it internally with staff, HR, finance, myself, along with our actuary, along with our pension counsel and city attorney, and are prepared to bring it forward for the board's consideration in December. But had talked to you all about it at our last meeting and wanted to bring it back to you again and ask that you consider making a recommendation to the board along with that consideration that we have in December. And staff is recommending the change as well. So I'll let Chris, we'll kind of go down the line, I guess, here, because we've got all the expertise here. We have looked at potential cost impacts. It seems manageable, really minimal. Again, it kind of depends on the decisions individuals make, but not dramatically different. We can reflect on that in any other details. So, Christine?
Well, I think Eric did a very nice job of bringing us to where we are today. Certainly, the task that we left the September meeting with was we asked our actuary to do an estimate of potential cost to the closed pension plan, and use assumptions the most reasonable assumptions that he we could use, and that has been provided in writing to you. And we'll ask Kevin Sullivan to give some comments to you on his analysis. We also, from September, asked our pension counsel and our city attorney to work together on language for what the item would to the full board would be to actually implement this change in language. And so we'll then allow Frank Carney, and then we have our city attorney, Shauna Billingsley, here, because that is, I think, the second part. But if we could start with, Kevin, if you could summarize, you wrote a letter to me dated November 21st with your assumptions on what the impact could be to the closed plan.
Okay, so in that letter, and Eric and Christine perfectly explained the change, so I'll just kind of talk about the impact. In general, when you look at making any change to a pension plan, you have to look at how participants are going to change their behavior, because it's inevitable that even small changes to the plan, people change their behavior. So we first looked at where folks retire right now under the plan and have historically, and how that might change with this change. Because, and as that chart on the top of the second page shows, right now there's a considerable bias towards retiring very close to the end of the year. About 2/3 of retirees retire in kind of that December to January timeframe, where they're getting the benefit of that full year of pay. And interestingly, this was only dated through January 1, 2022, but with the information that Sarah provided earlier, it would look exactly the same, because this shows about 2/3 retiring in December. What Sarah indicated was 61% for this year retiring in December, so it's exactly as expected. And we compared that to another large regional plan that uses the rolling months. So this plan uses the rolling 60 months. And a couple things you'll notice. One is that the distribution of months of retirement is much more uniform through the year, but there is still a bias towards the second half of the year and the end of the year. Folks just naturally like to retire around to the end of the year. It's kind of a nice stopping point for completeness and other things. So what we would expect to occur with this change is that you'll still have about 1/3 of your population retire uniformly throughout the year as they do now. Because if someone's retiring in April now, even though it might be much better for them to wait till December, they're going to continue to do that now when it's slightly better for them. But that 2/3 of the folks who are retiring right at the end of the year, we expect about half of them to actually probably retire a little earlier, and about half to continue to retire right around the end of the year, because a lot of folks do still retire at the end of the year. So if we kind of break down the cost change for those groups, the group who's still going to retire right at the end of the year, there's no cost change for them, because everything's going to work exactly as it does now, because the rolling 36 or the rolling 60 months is exactly the same as the 3-year and 5-year if you retire right at the end of the year. But for those folks who retire uniformly throughout the year, they will generally have a higher average earnings with the rolling 36 or 60 months than they do now. And so we would expect that group on average to have about a 6% increase in their costs. And that's looking at actual folks in terms of if they had retired when they did versus if they retire at the end of the year. Then for those folks who we expect to move to slightly earlier in the year from the end of the year, there's actually a cost decrease for them, because they're going to have slightly less service, and their average earnings will slightly decline, but it will not be near as much as it would be otherwise. But from what they're doing right now, it'll be a slight decline. So on average for these three groups, that's an average increase for the active liability of about 1.33%, which is about $1.1 million. If you look at that over the overall liability, it's about 0.62% of the overall liability. And that additional liability gets amortized over a 20-year period into the contribution. So the total impact on the contribution is a higher percentage at about 3.25%, or about $134,000 a year in additional cost. And again, the largest component of that is the amortization of the impact on existing liability, and that really goes away after 20 years where you've paid off that portion, and the remainder is only about a quarter of that total.
An interesting letter.
Sorry, Ross, I did not turn my microphone on. I can repeat all that if you want.
Any questions?
Yeah, remind me again, the catalyst for doing this is
Well, we,
just smoother throughout the year?
well, we had some employee requests.
Okay.
That would be a nice option to have and not have to wait till the end of the year when you hit your, whatever that benchmark
Maximum,
is. A lot of
yeah,
people's
yeah.
25 years. To be able to do that when you hit that benchmark as opposed to carrying through and having that flexibility. So we were asked by some employees to look into it. We looked into it and also just said, well, what kind of impact would that have? And we looked at it from an operational standpoint and said, well, it may help us with this larger exodus that we have at the end of the year. And so that seemed to have some operational benefit to potentially spread it out. And then it just, again, something that our folks ask, at least some of our folks ask us to consider.
And this would be normal in your world, that half and half or something like that, do it this way?
I'd say probably slightly more than half of public sector plans do the rolling months.
Okay.
Yep.
And I'll add to that, what Eric's saying is so true, is that this really came through employees talking to us a lot about this. It's not like a couple. A lot of employees are very excited about the possibility of, if they can retire in February, why wait until December? They're ready to go. And this would allow them to do so.
You're on.
I'm on. Well, and I think what they haven't mentioned, and that's kind of the crux of it, is you get to cash in your vacation time and your sick time at the end of, when you retire. If you've got accrued vacation and accrued sick time, under the current system, if you retire in June and you cash in 1,000 hours of vacation and sick time, that is going to affect that year's salary. But it's not going to push you above what you would be if you worked the entire year and then cashed in 1,000 hours, which is going to raise your overall average. The 36 months, that cash in will count in that last month. And so then it then affects your overall distribution, which is the biggest benefit for the employee, and that's why they're asking for it, is so that they can do that and not lose the benefit of cashing in their accrued sick time and vacation time.
Yeah, that's an important point. I should have made that. With going to the rolling 36 or 60 months, you generally see a nice, slow, steady, incremental increase in the average earnings through someone's last few years. With the current methodology, because of those additional items that get added in, you may be flat for 5, 6, 7 months, and then it begins to pop up once those additional items, and it may be 10, 11 months, so you get no benefit until you get towards the end of the year. So you almost create an incentive for someone not to retire during those 8, 10, 12 months, and then retire at the end of the year when you do get some benefit of adding those additional items in.
Well, if it's flat, it would be a non-incentive.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Because it's really an issue of, someone who's looking at retiring right now is or if someone has retired maybe at the end of October, it's pay through October plus those additional items. Is that greater than the salary from 3 years ago that it would replace? And for many people, it may not be, and so they're going to wait longer in the year to where it does replace that salary from 3 years ago, or 5 years ago if it's the 60 months.
Any other questions or comments?
Just one more comment, is I'll add this, is that because in HR, we're the ones who get a lot of these requests from employees. I know that a lot of these employees that have asked about are people that want to retire as soon as next year. So the hope would be that this could happen as soon as possible.
Yeah, our plan would be to bring it to the board for discussion at the December 13th work session with an expectation that we might be able to make it effective the early part of next year. I think maybe around February is what we had thought about with the timing to.
Well, that's something
take
that when
action.
Frank and Shauna make their
Yeah.
comments was how early that if it could, I believe even January, depending on it all is subject to full board approval, but if we go to the full board in January, if,
That'd be the first opportunity to vote. Is it one, it's one vote, right? It's not multiple readings. So it could happen in January. Just, I don't know if
It's a
we need any
resolution.
lead time from their decision to our implementation.
You could make it effective January, if even if it happened in, I'm sorry, you could make it effective January 1, even if it happened in February.
Yeah,
The
you could-
problem would be if someone retired before it was approved.
Yeah.
It'd be a little difficult. They'd really have to wait till it got approved.
Okay.
But you
But we
can't,
could do an immediate effectiveness too upon
you
approval.
could do that too. You can make it immediately effective. Yeah, you've
I
got-
just want to make sure administratively that doesn't create a
Right.
issue for us. That would be the only,
Yeah, we asked the same question.
Okay.
How fast can you make
Yeah.
this implemented?
okay.
and
So-
that's really the capacity of our actuary, because we, certainly when employees come into HR and they're interested, there's estimates done about retirement, but once the decision is made to go, it's the actuary who makes the final makes that calculation on what the benefit is going to be, and that's what we're provided by USI, is that calculation. So they do have the records and would be making that calculation on the change from a calendar year to a rolling year, should the board decide.
You know, I'll see if Sarah or Sarah's kind of hiding out, or Jill would have any comments about, because this is, we will be collecting additional information than we've historically collected, because typically we're collecting annual pay. This makes it a monthly pay calculation. So there's certainly some additional effort on both sides of that to gather it and provide it to us in the calculations. Now's probably a nice time to do it, because at the end of December, there's no difference for anyone, but beginning for anyone who's retiring at the end of
Yeah.
January, that's when it starts being different.
So
David?
our role in this, I mean, finance has looked at this, so the 3 1/4 adjustment, we're all good with that. I mean, our role is just to say,
From a board
Yeah.
standpoint, from this committee standpoint, it's being approved by us. It will be going to the full board then, and we'll probably go to a workshop next, now, I guess
On the
it's next
13th,
Tuesday.
yeah.
Next Tuesday.
okay.
And will be discussed by the full board, and then would go to a January board meeting to be voted on then. I don't see it being voted in December without discussion and some
Sure.
allowance for it to be vetted, I guess, through the board itself then. So it would be, the first reading would be in January. First,
And
well, the
you all-
only one.
Yeah, it's really only one reading. You all would provide a recommendation to the board, and then they would consider it. We'd talk to them. The general process would be, I'd assume, a vote in January, and then we could put it into effect after that.
Any other questions or comments?
May I also, part of the process from the September meeting was, of course, the USI doing their analysis, but also the attorneys doing their work on how this would be implemented legally, because of course, we currently have a plan document that does say calendar year calculation. And I think that's something that this board, I mean, this group is spending the time to understand the intent as well as the steps and this type of details. Mr. Carney, you could talk about what the legally, we have a resolution as well as a plan amendment, because this would be a change to the pension plan. And then just maybe also talking through how to make sure that the group that's the 36-month group stays the 36-month group, the 60-month group stays the 60-month group, and how that works legally. I believe this committee would be interested in.
Yeah, well, when you pass a resolution, then we would incorporate the results of that resolution into a plan amendment. So it'd be a formal plan amendment. And you had some language in this resolution. It was a little confusing because it seemed to not take into account your 36-month employees. But we had done some amendments on that didn't get into this resolution. So we've kind of exchanged our emails. And Sean and I will go over again. We'll make sure that it's not changing any computation period for somebody that's in a 36 or 60 month, other than going from a calendar year to a rolling year. So we'll, before the 13th, we'll have a revised.
Let's do one more clarification too, because this came up last time we talked about it. We had made the adjustment in the plan that allowed for folks that went on disability for a time frame near the end of their, within that 3-year window.
Right.
We allowed to substitute a year.
Right.
So what we now are allowing is to just look at the 36 months,
Yeah, you basically.
excluding that time you might have been on approved disability.
Right, basically, instead of substituting a year, you're substituting months until you get back to a month at which they got their full pay.
Right,
So
right.
it does- it just substitutes months instead of years.
This allows us to provide the same adjustment for those who might
Right.
have been dealing with a approved disability situation. And so it gets us there.
Right.
It also addresses this further request. So we're both meeting the need that had been adjusted not too long ago, and then adding this consideration to move to a month time frame as opposed to full calendar years.
Any other questions or comments? I'm gonna recognize, since I'm assuming they're not here for security reasons,
We're very
as many. Have you listened? Are there any questions?
That's been great, very educational.
Okay,
All right.
all right. I'll entertain a motion to forward this to the full board,
I'd like to make that motion.
okay?
With the only caveat that we will have a little different language than what you've got in
Right,
front of
okay.
you. So with that change, which we'll get to you quickly.
Clyde, I'll second.
All right, let's do a roll call vote. Mr. McDaniel,
Approve.
Mr. Townsend,
Approved.
Mr. Bull,
Approve.
Ms. Carter,
Approve.
and the chair votes yes on that, okay? Let's go to item 7, consideration of resolution 2022-79, a cost of living policy for the closed plan. Mr. Stuckey, you're up.
I will kick this off as well. This is also an item we talked about at our last meeting and have provided this and developed this a little further. This is the item related to providing a more specific policy around the adjustments to the pension for cost of living. And we have had a practice for a long time of calculating the CPI from March to March and applying it. This past year with significantly higher inflation, we did essentially place a cap on that. And from that, staff stepped back and said, let's have a more specific policy. We did survey other pension programs and especially best practices within the pension world, if you will, to see, and it's very common to have some form of cap or cap on that inflationary adjustment. So we provided a recommendation on that. We also paired that with a funding level, like a segregation or a differentiation based on the level of funding within the plan, about how that would affect the maximum amount of cost of living adjustment that we would be able to make. But it also provides a floor, a minimum, in at least 2 of those funding categories. So there's a chart on the second page of this resolution that I think gives you a pretty clear description. The other piece that will really be a board decision, we are suggesting that this be adopted as a board policy by resolution as opposed to an amendment to the plan. Once you amend the plan to reflect it, it really becomes law. And that would really prevent the board in the future from having any flexibility to modify this meaningfully. So we would suggest, but the board will ultimately get to make this decision, that should they want to pursue this approach, that they do it through resolution. That way it's clear. That way it's done outside of any specific year situation. It is the guidelines that we have and that we apply and implement on the board's behalf. So this is what we've developed. I think it's pretty much the same as what we shared with you a few months ago. But we will also bring this to the board at the December 13th meeting for discussion, and see if Christine or any of the rest of our team want to add anything to that.
I did because, just for the complexity, we spent a lot of time in September on this, but I did want to just refresh on a couple of pieces because there's certainly the aspect of couple different pieces of this potential policy. Certainly, as Eric gave a summation to, the current plan document is just, it allows a cost of living increase, but it does not say how the board is to implement. It's just allowed to do so. And so then we looked at the current practice, which for the last 13 years or so, 14 years, has been a practice that, as Eric described, is looking at the change in the CPI, a certain CPI table, and then implement that upon board approval in July. We then talked about what was going on earlier this calendar year. The Board of Mayor and Aldermen did do a cost of living increase of 4.5% for 2022. Then we came together in September and discussed perhaps a policy that is tiered to the funded ratio of the plan, and we spent time going through what is the history of the funded ratio for this plan, as well as when we've had a practice for the cost of living increase, what has that practice been over the modern period? Because of course this plan does go back to 1971. It's been in existence a good number of years, but we did look at more of the modern era because it has modernized over that long of a period of time. I did want to just show again the history in this modern era of cost of living adjustments. Excluding 1992 and 2023, when it's been a calculation based off of that change. Sorry about that. It has averaged a little over 2%, and that's something that there always has been something awarded every year. We thought that was an interesting observation, is that there has even been a year of 1%, certainly a couple of years in the 1% range, but the board, even in a couple of years in which the board did not do raises for active employees, the board did do cost of living adjustments for the closed pension plan. So that practice was an interesting observation. And then we looked at the funded ratio of a pretty similar period, and we think this is also something that's valuable to have that perception of. We did note, we gave a little bit of background, certainly on the 2014 state law in Tennessee that says if your funded ratio is less than 60%, a public pension plan may not give additional benefits unless approved by the state treasurer. That rule was not in place back the only year that this plan in modern history has fallen below the 60%. That was before the 2014 law came into effect. So when we were looking at developing tiers and where were the natural tiers, we looked at certainly the below 60% tier. We looked at the 80% funded ratio as being generally accepted as a well-funded plan. Certainly, the higher the ratio, you want to be as close to 100% as you can. But in talking, and certainly in looking at our actuary as well as best practices, an 80% is generally well-funded, and then somewhere between the 60% and 80% is you're not considered poorly funded, but you're not as well funded as you would be if you were 80% or above. But we have always been above 60%, except for 1 year in the modern history, and then we have been mostly in the when we haven't been at least 80%, we've been in the 70s. I think 6 or 7 times during the modern era.
So when was the under the 60%? I'm trying to look.
That was in the early 2000s. That was after the board.
That's when the major adjustment
Increased the
in the plan
benefits.
structure was made.
2003?
I think
Yes.
you remember that time.
Yep.
So that was understandable why the ratio fell below the 60% with the additional benefits added.
So Christine, one thing we talked about, I think, as you were making phone calls or talking to other plans, so this is, again, not trying to copy what everybody's doing, but this is normal in the industry. I mean, even to give 1%, I think that's interesting that you don't give active employees anything, but a former employee would get 1%. But anyway, that's normal.
Well, in doing the survey of the highly funded plans, there were a few that did 1%. Certainly, not all of them did, but because ours had a practice of giving 1%, as we developed a potential policy for consideration, it seemed like the practice of the 1%, as long as you're not below 60%,
Right.
that was something that would incorporate what this board has been doing as a practice. So, you're referring to the survey of well-funded plans. Other than just a couple of them that do some things that are a little bit outside, I think, what our board would probably feel comfortable with. Most of them have, but they all do have cost of living policies that has some teeth to it. Most of them are in the 3% range. Some of them are not as high as 3%. Some have some caveats, but there are some that have the 1%. So that practice here, that's been a practice for
Yeah.
some time. But you are correct that certainly has been, even Eric, during your time as leadership, there's been a couple of years that active employees did not receive a raise when retirees did.
I think philosophically, we looked at best practices. We also looked at what we had done and thought, as we're memorializing a cap, let's also memorialize what had been our practice of at least a minimum. And then Christine especially looked at this further factoring in these tiers of where we were on a level of funding. And so I think putting those all together is a nice way to build this, and it puts a certainty in place, helps us manage it, and really keep the fund where it needs to be over time, but also recognize the impact of cost of living on our retirees. So it's blending all of those together and keeping the fund in a sustainable position.
David, I think that the board felt the same thing as what they're saying here, is that we had generally always done that. I couldn't remember any time that we did not have a cost of living increase for the retirees. And I guess this is my 31st year to be on the board. So I didn't, that was pretty much what we thought when we were looking at that. I think I'll be honest with you, I think you had stability on the board, and we understood what this meant as far as setting the precedent. And
Yeah.
we were not uncomfortable with the cost of living increase. We were also unfortunately uncomfortable with not doing a increase with the current employees on certain years, but we thought that this was somewhat appropriate. Christine,
And
continue.
I'll just put up the this is just the summary of what's in the resolution, that it's now, the resolution for discussion and consideration is now numbers 2022-79, and put a little bit of colors into the chart to hopefully make it more visible on the screen, but to point out the tiers. So with that, nothing has changed in what we showed you before, but we did want to run through a little bit of the history, because it seems to point toward what the item of question is.
So at 80% funded, we would be between 1 and 3.5?
Yes, with the
And-
with the calculation still being performed every year, and put into these tiers to see where the calculation falls.
And when was the last time, I was trying to look at this, when was the last time we were under 80%? It has to be, numbers.
It has been it's been the last few years. It has been 2019, we were at 73%. So the falling under 80%, while it's not been every year, we have been between 70 and 80 about 6 times in the modern period.
Okay. And this is just a little deviant, so 2019, what did we fund from a budget standpoint? Do you remember?
I don't remember that number exactly, but of course, we always fund at least the actuarial amount.
Right.
And I think 3 out of the last 4 years, we've put an additional contribution above and beyond that to help bolster the fund. Of course, we did pension obligation bonds, how many years ago? 7, 8 years ago, something like that. So the board has taken very seriously its responsibility to fund this the closed pension plan sufficiently and above and beyond where needed. So we look at this, and of course, we are impacted by markets and other factors that always play a role, but we do appreciate the consistent support the board's provided.
The board during this period always funded what it was required to fund. We did not find, that was not,
Never been
that was not a concern of not funding the actuarial contribution, but certainly as the amount of the assets increased and then the market volatility, and then you take that 12/31 snapshot of wherever you are, that is as the fund gets larger, that volatility becomes more into play in the calculation that our actuary performs, as well as over time. And I really do think that what our board has done and this committee has supported in reducing our the investment assumption rate incrementally over time has certainly, that has been a way to grow into what is a best practice of having a lower investment assumption rate. But that does put a little bit of pressure on the funded ratio.
That's what I remember from 4 years ago. We decided to get out in front of that.
Yep.
And
Yes.
that's been helpful, but I
chipping
think
away.
we're
Yep.
going to have to keep doing that, though.
Yes.
We'll be
And we will be doing that, but certainly on our open plan, TCRS made a large change at one time, and we saw the results of that when the actuary studies came out. If you wait to do a 50 basis point or 75 basis point change, you're going to impact that funded ratio in 1 year
Yeah.
even more. And we've got the person who can speak to that in the.
It
Yeah,
makes for a longer meeting between us.
Yeah, that's right.
I was going to comment, so we're closing out a year where the investment return hasn't been kind to us. So that funded ratio of 91% is most certainly to fall. So it's not out of the realm of possibility we could test that 80% at 1/1/2023.
Any other questions or comments on the cost of living policy? Then I will.
Yeah, I've
Go
got,
ahead.
if you don't mind. Do we have information or research on how often the 1% historically would have come into effect? That is, that the CPI would have been below 1%?
We did look at that for that full presentation. I don't have it with me today, but certainly when we went back to get to this summarization,
Yeah, you would have had it 08, 09, you would have had it maybe 16.
in 2011, when we were right at 1%, that's one that probably wasn't an even 1%.
We certainly rounded up. I
There was some
remember.
rounding up,
Yes.
and you would have
I remember that,
Probably won't be an issue for the next 10 years.
yeah.
Doesn't look like.
Because
But
well, and the reason I ask, I tried to get the CPI numbers to look at them to see, and I don't know if I pulled the right. the-
tables.
There's lots of tables, so I'm not sure, and I could not find very many. I think the ones that I pulled, I could only find a couple of years, and they were in the 60s, where the CPI was below 1, which means that the having the minimum really doesn't benefit the recipients that much, because if it never applies, then there's not a benefit. So I guess my first question is making sure that, trying to figure out if my information that I've looked at is correct, or if I have bad information.
Yeah, it looks like 09 would be the only, I've just pulled it up.
What was it in '09?
-0.4.
And I think 2015 as well.
Okay.
Was 0.1.
Yeah, .1, yeah.
Okay.
But you got some, I mean, 16 was 1.3. You got some that are closer, but.
Well, and that's also, it's a good point to talk about, because for so many years, even plans that have had caps in place, we think about the TCRS, the Tennessee Consolidated Retirement System cap's been in place for many, many, many years, and it never hit it. I mean, and it's 3% with TCRS, and for so long, it rocked along something, the actual TCRS provision, it never even hit the cap, and the cap was in place. And so what's happened in the last couple of years here is, I mean, we talk about we haven't experienced this in a long time, and we truly haven't. So these, I heard TCRS give a presentation right before the announcement of the 2022 COLA, and certainly they never say until they actually use April numbers. We use March, but they were saying there in January and February it'll be 3%, because they knew that it was already what was going on, and they probably hadn't hit that cap in probably 20, 30, 40 years, maybe even 40 years, but certainly not in the kind of period we're even looking at here. So the range of we've been living through a time of very stable prices, and we've been accustomed to what we're seeing on, really from about that 93 to 2022 on this chart, fiscal year basis, was we were accustomed to it, and we really didn't have to think that much about what people who had lived and worked in the 70s and early 80s had to deal with.
Yeah, and these are, I think the numbers all of us are looking at are calendar year numbers, so March to March may be a little different. But in the last 20 years through the end of 2021, it looks like there were 2 years where it was below 1% and 2 years where it would have been above 3.5%. So I kind of see that as the benefit of a range. You're kind of cutting some off one end, cutting some off the other end, and kind of keeping you kind of in the middle. So that's.
And like I said, those aren't the numbers that I was able to find.
March to March, it'd have been very.
So which is why I wanted to ask the question to see, if it's 2 years we're here and 2 years we're there. My main concern is, at the end of the day, over a recipient's lifetime, a retiree's lifetime, how are they going to stack up against the CPI? If we're going to implement a program or a plan that over a 20-year span or a 25-year span, they're going to be 1%, 1.5% behind, 2% behind CPI over that period of time, then I don't think that's a good deal for the retirees. If we've got a plan that's gonna keep up with CPI, then I'm good with it. But that's what I've tried to look at, again, maybe with the wrong data. But that has been my focus as far as this goes since our last meeting. And looking at this, I understand that over the past 30 years that we've been between the 1 and 3.5. Mm-hmm. But part of the catalyst for this, for doing this, is we had a really high inflation over the last year, and we're concerned that may persist for the next several years. And so if we're capping it at 3.5 for the next several years, and for the next several years we've got CPI or inflation that's at 5, 6, 7, 8%, then that puts our retirees way behind. And that's something I'm not sure is the best idea.
I mean, I totally hear what you're saying. I think our challenge is, it is a best practice, and it's a best practice for a reason, in that you just can't have an open-ended obligation, and whatever inflation is, it is, and you have to meet it, because that's an unknown. By having some cap and some floor, we can define what that's going to be, and that helps us work in what our long-term requirements are going to be. It's, we hope to not be in that situation where we're not keeping pace, but this pointed out a weakness in our overall plan, that we didn't have that ability to say, okay, this is more than the plan maybe should be able to bear, and if that occurs too frequently, it could really put us in a tough funding position. So we tried to responsibly blend that. We've picked a number that is on the upper end of what we got from looking at practices of other pension systems. So that's what we're trying to balance. We don't want our retirees to lose ground, but it is a world that there are caps in what happens in Social Security. There are caps in what happens in other pension programs, such as TCRS. And, we've tried to strike the right balance there, but appreciate your feedback on that, and something I know the board is considering too, and I've heard some of those same comments when we first discussed it earlier this year. So this is our attempt to try to address all of that as completely and in as a balanced a way as we can.
Is it an option? Is there an option to add something to it that basically says, look, every 5 years, every 10 years, we're going to look at this, and if we're falling way behind and we're 100, we're really well funded.
Yeah.
We fell behind because we had some bad years. Now we've had a run of good years. We can catch you up this year. And that we kind of look at that and try to. If that makes any sense.
This would not really preclude the board from doing that if they so choose. That's part of the reason we didn't want to make it a plan amendment, because we didn't want to totally lock it in. The way it's written now, the board has the option to provide an adjustment whenever and however it wants, essentially. That's my
Or
very
to
loose
change the
language.
resolution.
Yeah.
They could change the
So
resolution
That
and-
can be
yeah.
addressed, or they could do a supplement on top of what this policy dictates.
Yeah.
This approach, at least the approach we're taking at this point, does not prohibit that. And that's something the board could consider. That's something that maybe certain circumstances could dictate. This doesn't prevent them from doing that. I don't know how you would specifically fold that in unless you just did a calculation on a 5 or 10 year basis and just made the board aware of it, and then they could act however they wanted to from there. But
That was just off the top of my head,
Yeah.
so I don't either. It was just,
Any other questions or comments? Good comments. Then I will entertain a motion that we send this approve with committee approval and send it to the full board. Will this also be on the, this month's workshop?
you're going to get a double dose of pension at the work session on December 13th.
All right. Is there a motion?
Motion to approve?
Proper motions or a second?
Second.
Then let's do a roll call vote. Mr. McDaniel,
Approve.
Mr. Townsell,
For approval.
Mr. Bull,
yes.
and Ms. Carter,
Approve.
and the chair votes yes on that. That motion will be forwarded to the full board for next Tuesday's workshop. Any other questions or comments to come before the committee? I think we've been very productive, to be perfectly candid with you.
I do have a question.
Go ahead.
That was brought to me, that I didn't know the answer to, so, and maybe nobody in here does either. The question had to do with, police officers working off-duty, and how they were paid for that time, if they were working private security at a church or at another event, and were they paid by that entity or were they paid by the city? And if they were paid by the city, does that factor into their pension, to their average compensation and their pension calculations?
Yeah, so at one point, that was being paid often directly by the entity to the officer. That has been changed to run through the city, both to capture that, to also make sure that they have other kind of liability and workers' comp protection for those folks in performing those duties, and that then does become eligible for the calculation in their pension as well. So it does get factored in. We've updated the rates, and that is administered through the city now. And so that really kind of makes it comparable to treatment of other pay, and it does factor into the pension calculation.
Thank you, thank you.
So are they paid by the hour, and it's a set hourly figure? for it?
Exactly, yes.
So- Okay.
And we do have, there's the events that people sign up for, approach us about, or request. There is a structure that allows sort of long-term entities to have a standing agreement that might be a slightly different rate because they use it so regularly. Things like the hospital or churches that use pretty much the same officer at the same time every week throughout the year. They do have the ability to do a specific agreement with us, but all that gets captured, run through the city, and therefore it's got all the elements, including pension, that their regular pay sees, which is to their benefit and makes it cleaner for working with the contractor as well.
I do think I drive by the same one on Sunday mornings.
Yep.
Right. Because the one that's dancing, he's not hard to pick out.
He's a memorable one.
Any other questions or comments? If not, I'll entertain a motion.
May I have some
Yes.
other business?
Set a time.
Wanted to ask the committee about considering that our next meeting would be on Monday, March the 27th. That's a little bit later in March than we normally get together, but there is a school spring break the week of March the 13th for both local school districts, and I would rather us get back together a little bit later rather than earlier because we want the actuary to be able to give you a good look, the best he can, on what the results will be for this calendar year. So that is also a full board meeting that very next day to our chairman. But this would be Monday, March the 27th at 1 p.m. If we maybe placeholder it, and I'll get back with you to see if that would work.
And one question and one comment. I do invite the board members to this meeting. I do extend an invitation to them. And Sarah, did you say there was 95 new hires and 13 retirees this year?
This year, yes.
All right, then, do we have a motion to adjourn? Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor indicate by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? We are adjourned.